Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Smith, and this is going to be an edition of the Justice Devotions podcast. And we're streaming live from the Presbyterian Voices for Justice Facebook page, my Facebook page, Teacher on the Radio, and a bunch of other Facebook pages. And we're going to be talking today with author and activist Lindsey Krinks. Lindsey Krinks has a brand new book out called Praying with Our Feet. You can buy this at Parnassus Bookstore in Nashville, if you are in Nashville, and support independent bookstores and get her autograph in the front part, or you can buy it anywhere else that you like to buy books. So this being the PV for J page, and we do church in the streets, which is kind of what your jam is, by the way. I'm going to begin with a short reading and a short word of a blessing for our 45, what's going to be our 45 minutes together this afternoon. So from today's daily lectionary, Psalm 126, may those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. Those who go out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, carrying their sheaves. Let us pray. God of the universe, God of the streets, God of the unhoused, and God of the incarcerated, God who liberates us from our privilege and also liberates us from our poverty. Come and work through Lindsey and me today as we have a conversation about her fantastic new book and all of the great work that created it. We welcome you into our presence online and throughout your beautiful and wonderful springtime world, and as we prepare for Holy Week. So bless Lindsey, bless me, and anyone who might listen in on this broadcast today or archived later. Amen. Amen. So how did you get here? So I was reading your book. First of all, is it a memoir? Is that correct?
It is. It's a spiritual memoir. Yes.
So, because I thought, she could have written a full-blown theology treatise or manifesto, but it's autobiography.
Yeah, it's all about stories. It's one thing to tell people about what you're seeing and what you've seen on the streets. It's another thing to take them there. It's one thing to tell people how you interpret scripture. It's another thing to embody it and to live out those stories and to bring people into them through the writing. So that's what I really hope to do, not to make it about me, but to really draw people into the realities we see on a day-to-day basis on the streets. And I hope that that's what people get out of it.
Well, there's a lot of your personal fear and doubt and anxiety that fills the margins of this. So no one is going to go take this book. First of all, I read it in one weekend. I haven't devoured a book like this in a really long time. I pick up way more books than I finish. And so I saw myself in this. I'm a lot older than you, but I saw a lot of myself in this text. In my journey, I went to Atlanta to Ed Loring and Murphy Davis when I was 19 years old. And I lived in the on 910 Ponce de Leon, which is now this obscene condominium. If you drive by the old Open Door community, it's now this it's really gross. Anyway, but at my house when I was a kid, the Dorothy Day books and the Sojourners magazine and the Martin Luther King Jr. speeches. So my parents were kind of lefty Christians. You come from a very religious background, but your parents weren't on the Christian. They certainly weren't Christian anarchists, as described in Amos House website, which I just looked up this afternoon. The loose-knit Catholic worker community, ecumenical Catholic worker community that you're a part of in Nashville. So how did you tell the story in the book, but can you say in your own words for our listeners and for me even, how did it feel to discover Thomas Merton for the first time and to discover, Dorothy Day for the first time in the midst of, learning about Nashville homelessness? What was that awakening like for you? And did you ever have a moment where you're actually, no, I should have gone to Oral Roberts instead of Vanderbilt Divinity, or I should, I'm really a conservative. Why am I doing the journey from a more traditional Southern Christian upbringing to the radical church of the streets? What was that like, discovering that and changing into all that?
I grew up in a really conservative church in South Carolina in the foothills, and my parents were great. My dad is still very conservative, but we also learned to think critically. You know, my mom really valued education, so thinking critically, asking questions was a big part of what we did. And you know, I really got into some trouble when I came to Nashville for undergrad at Lipscomb, which is, again, a more conservative school, Church of Christ school, branching out a little bit more in recent years. But I got in trouble when I started taking theology classes and rereading the prophets and the gospel with a broader context, a broader historical context for one, but also a broader social and economic and political context where I was seeing people suffer because of unjust systems, not just because of what I was taught growing up. People make their own decisions and then they, you know, reap the benefits. But really, when I started to read the prophets, read the gospel, read Jesus, and see his life not in a social vacuum, right? Then it was a very slippery slope to radicalism for me. I always say, you know, Dorothy Day was certainly one of the people that helped provide a model for me and show me what people of faith can really do in the world when they take their faith out of the private sphere alone and live in the public sphere. Our faith was never just meant for our own personal edification or morality. It was meant to change the world so that there is less suffering, so that there is less poverty, so that the beloved community, that the kingdom of God, that collective liberation can be on earth as it is in heaven. And once I kind of realized that, and reading those texts and then being introduced to people like Merton and Day and Oscar Romero and so many others, it was like this was like a fire in my belly, or like this like light in my bones. It just like it lit up everything. Everything made sense to me, and it was very clear that I was being called to step into a less comfortable lifestyle and get my hands dirty a little bit more. And I'm thankful to have found a lot of comrades in Nashville that are living that out alongside us.
Did you ever fall away from faith, though? In that, did you leave? I mean, did you ever have a dark night of the soul where you didn't identify as a Jesus follower, or did you ever have like, I really need to worship the goddess today? I'm not, you know, this patriarchal stuff, not today. I mean, did you I don't know, did you go run around the woods and, you know, want to talk to the druids? I mean, did you have that? For me, the church, Jesus has never been a problem for me, but I've had so many problems with the church. And did you ever, or has it always been rooted in the gospel, this radical? Because I know some of your friends, and there's some pretty wild people in Nashville doing some very confrontational work around the prison system and around corporate capitalism's sort of, you know, the gentrification of the soul, and pushing your friends out of the, you know, the people who are from Nashville, pushing them out of the city to make room for another hipster condominium. And but did you stay with Jesus through the whole journey?
You know, I absolutely have had a reckoning and a falling away from some churches. I work with churches every day in Nashville, and I absolutely love working with them. But being in a more conservative Church of Christ faith community was no longer possible for me at a certain point in my life. I will say that I did have an experience. It wasn't so much as of a falling away of faith, but I did have a really, during a season of burnout, which I read about in the book, there was a season where I felt so dry spiritually. I couldn't pray. I couldn't journal. I couldn't write. I was so burned out and so dry. And I would hear something at church like, you know, come with me, follow me, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And I'd be like, well, that's some BS, you know. I'm like, whatever, like, you know, like I was so burned out. But I was hearing that in a wealthy church, and it just didn't make sense to me anymore, you know. And so I did have that experience, but what brought me back to myself was not only the people on the streets that I was working with, doing this work in community, but also definitely reconnecting with the natural world. I started going on walks, in the woods. And I would say, my roots are in the Christian tradition. It's a faith that, it's the well that I drink from. It is where my roots are. But it's definitely expanded too. Like my faith has, it's so much broader and more expansive than it used to be, to fit nicely in a little box. It doesn't do that anymore. I'm an interfaith street chaplain. So
I love that. And it's totally where I've landed. And I don't like it when I have atheist friends in the movement. A lot of my friends in the movement are not religious, and they always want to tell me, but your God says you only can worship him, because I'll bring in some feminist, some feminist woo-woo Starhawk stuff. And they'll be like, but what do you say though? How do you evangelize the movement to your Christian friends, especially when you're working with people who want that kind of weekend Sabbath do-gooder? They want to come and be in solidarity for a day. And they want to wash the feet of a really smelly person for a day and then go back, to like, what do you say when, because I visit, we have camps in Cookeville, and I've started visiting the camps. And to be honest, even though we've never really had, this is the first long conversation you and I've ever had. We've seen each other in passing, but like, I literally, like, this book is my manual, and so I'm out visiting in the camps, and I ride my bike, and I rode my bike to this camp tour I did a few weeks ago here in Cookeville. I'll do another one hopefully next week during Holy Week. But I'd parked my bike outside this one camp that was abandoned, and some guy drives up to me and he wants to minister to me. He assumed I'm a member of the unhoused community, which I was like, okay, good. Like, I don't look too pretentious here on my bicycle. And I explained to him that I was kind of like him. I was out here to help, and he immediately went to how many souls he'd saved, in the camps. And what do you say to people when they find out that you're a minister and that you work with the homeless, that they think you're there just to save the home? I mean, like, how do we explain the kind of stuff that we do to people who think we're there? Because I'm in it to save my own ass, like, yeah. I'm in bad shape when I'm not doing the kind of stuff that you do. I've had times when I didn't and times when I did. My spiritual health is better when I'm helping those on the streets or who are incarcerated. Yeah. But what do you say to the person who thinks that you're there to, like, give them Jesus? How do you unpack that for like a youth group? Like, let's say you got like a youth group or the church board of elders all come together to do a day of service with you, and somebody says something like, probably sincerely even. How do you unpack that for a newbie to the streets?
I love that question, because I think I remember hearing from someone some point in the past, and it's been a kind of thing I've adopted myself. I have no interest in converting anyone to Christianity other than Christians, right? Like, that's part of our work. Like, you and me, that's part of our work to help Christians really not just be those, like, Sunday Christians or, like, save the soul Christians or private faith Christians, morality, like, all those things, but to really follow in the steps of a, like, homeless Galilean who overturned the tables of exploitation, who cared about people's bodies, like healed bodies, and kind of got on the wrong side of the tracks, the wrong side of people in power. So whenever I'm working with a group, which I do every week, I meet them where they are. So at first I would meet the person where they are. I would meet the youth group where they are, and start with where they're coming from, and then try to expand their definition and say, oh, that's interesting. Like, I actually find, God more out here. And I see people that have a faith that I can't comprehend because they're depending on God for their next meal. I don't have to trust God that much, so, like, asking the person, like, well, where have you seen God on the streets? Like, where have you seen God out here? How does Jesus come to you? How are you ministered in this work? And then by letting them know, like, hey, like, I am caring for people's spirits too, but but I also care about their bodily conditions. Like I'm trying to do emotional and spiritual support for people while I'm out here, but their relationship is important. They have to have what they need in order to move forward. And I believe Jesus cares about, and God cares about justice. Like there are clear threads. Read those prophets, and holy cow, like we should be overturning tables and like raising holy hell like all the time, if we're really going to follow in the steps of the prophets and Jesus. So I always just try to expand on where people are and trouble those kind of neat categories that people place them in, and place themselves in. But it's, what I've found is it's relational work that actually helps people change. And it's hard work. I get really frustrated with ministers like that, with churches like that who want to serve the poor, but they don't want to talk about why so many are in poverty. They're blind to these other factors. But I really tried in my more generous moments, I really try to tell myself, you know what? When I didn't realize how things were, and I was in a more conservative space, people accompanied me to help me open my eyes. How can I do that for other people? There are times that we call people in, to that more liberative work. Our liberation is bound up together. And every now and then there's a time we call people out, but we always try to call people in, right, as much as we can. So I try to do that as much as I can.
Can you talk to us for a minute? And this is a very present concern I have right now. Oh, I love the slogan, some of the movement slogans like, house keys, not handcuffs. I love Ingrid's project with the tiny house village. But I have always been a bit of a nomad myself. And I've always identified with the members of the unhoused community who, not all of them would be like, if I were to live that way, I would definitely be downwardly mobile. Now, not all of them are downwardly mobile, but I've met some that are, I'm not saying that they're choosing it per se, but that given the alternatives, that they don't necessarily want to plug into the charity industrial complex. Mm-hmm. And so we've got a lot of camps right now in Cookeville, and we've got a lot of panhandling in Cookeville. And the law, so Lindsey lives in Nashville. I live in Andrew. You're listening to an edition of the Justice Devotions podcast, and we're a social justice podcast, and we're talking about homelessness and Lindsey's fantastic new autobiographical memoir called Praying with Our Feet. So how do we talk to folks, and how do we talk to ourselves, like that we're not there to fix the camp, or we're not there to abolish camping. Like we're not an anti-camping because we're pro-housing. We're not anti-camping, or because we're pro, universal basic income. We're not anti-begging. Like, how do we talk to people about begging, camping, urinating, defecating, litter? Like, how do we talk to them about like the lived reality of the streets in such a way that they can? So what happened here in Cookeville that's led to this legislation that you're aware of, mm-hmm. that Ryan Williams is proposing, by the way, Ryan.Williams, look him up. He's a Cookeville, Tennessee House of Representatives. He's proposing a law to ban getting flying a sign on an exit ramp on every interstate in Tennessee right now, which is one of the primary places a person can get income in the begging, if they're a beggar. So talk to me from your perspective, both from a theological perspective, but also from like a social justice activist perspective. Why do we not want them to stop begging? Why do we want them not? Why are we? I would be assuming, because I've read your book, that you're okay with camping. Like, why is camping okay, an okay option if they prefer camping to living in a church basement or living in a rescue mission? Or so, what is it about camping, begging, going to the bathroom, things like that? Why are those things the things that everybody's so upset about that they would pass a law against it? And why do we find ourselves, when we do our work, wanting to panhandle with them, or wanting to go to a camp or do a street tour like you guys did in Holy Week, where you all decided to beg for your own? At least there's one section in the book where you all went and were we're beggars too. So talk to me about because it seems kind of stupid of us, right? I mean, like on the surface, right? So why would we be okay with them pooping in the woods, living in the woods, panhandling on the street? Why aren't we against the panhandling?
Yeah, people ask these things all the time. We are for Open Table Nashville. We are for housing for all. We are for, basic incomes. We are for living wage. So like we are trying to create a world where people have options to move into dignified housing, to not have to feel like they have to take a sign out to a street corner. And until that world is created, we support people where they are. In Nashville, for instance, I have people living in camps right now who the options for housing for them are incredibly dehumanizing. They are either disabled and on fixed income, or they're never going to make enough to afford dignified housing. When they think about housing, they don't think about an apartment with a pool or a nice balcony. They don't think about a duplex with a yard or a house with a yard. They think about their options, which are the projects or the slums or places that are incredibly in like drug infested neighborhoods where people are knocking on their doors at night and there are roaches and bed bugs, or the hotels, that are way overpriced and way run down. Some people, because of their experiences of trauma, feel more like they have more dignity in the woods, kind of charting out their own path, able to assert their own agency over their material conditions than they have in some of the shelter and mission and housing options. And so until we can find dignified housing for them, options for them that they want, we're going to support them where they are. I have a radical view of the land that is not based in capitalism or the private property laws that we have. And if you think back to Jubilee, this kind of idea in the Hebrew Bible of every so many years returning the land back to people, you can see a more radical idea of the land there too. But the land is becoming, and housing and resources are becoming more and more privatized in the United States, especially after the Great Recession. More and more homes went into bank ownership after the foreclosure crisis, and then they were auctioned off to developers. So we've had the rise of the corporate landlord. I say that to say that we're creating a class in the United States, a renter class, and people that cannot afford their own housing and will always be kind of under the control of the landlord or, whoever. And that's really hard for some folks. They don't have the same options. I feel the same way about, panhandling. First of all, in a lot of faith traditions, there is this call to give alms to the poor. So there have always been people asking for money, and I think it's totally fine to give whatever we have. If it's a couple dollars we feel comfortable doing, that's great. If we carry supplies with us, we always tell people, carry socks, carry water, carry things that you can give out to people to at least show compassion. But what is interesting is that folks flying signs are actually able to make more than they can with a minimum wage job. So until we have real options for them that can meet them where they are, take into account their circumstances and everything, people are going to have to keep doing that because they're trying to survive. And we think that the freedom of speech, the First Amendment, should cover them. The law that the Tennessee representatives are trying to pass right now has a number of constitutional issues with it. And we're interested in exploring challenging it on that level. So we're following that closely. But, nobody will understand why people are doing what they're doing, why people choose to, be in the woods instead of a shelter until you hear the stories, until you feel how much your dignity is taken away when you're in a crowded shelter where orders are barked at you all the time, where you have to go to Sunday school classes just to get food. Like people's dignity is worn down in those situations. So it's really about getting to know people where they are and listening to their stories and taking those seriously and fighting for a world that people still have choices and options, but that they have way more dignified options than what we're able to offer as a society right now.
At the beginning of the pandemic and right after the tornado, I had this brief moment where I thought that universal basic income was going to be passed forever, and the stimulus checks are so popular across the otherwise deep chasm of ideology right now in our culture. I thought UBI was finally here, and I'm still hopeful of all the issues that we're all working on together. That's one that I'm more hopeful of than others. But the judgment. So there's a lot of people now have started to work with the unhoused. We had a lot of awareness brought to our community, unhoused community, last summer because the mayor and some of our local officials were trying to pass all these laws. We stopped them, by the way. We had a grassroots movement of myself and several of my friends. We all were very outspoken, and the city council people who were not all the way in favor researched all the First Amendment and legal problems with the way they'd written their law. And that I think ultimately what ended up happening was that the city lawyer got cold feet, that they weren't going to be able to survive the legal challenges. And so it died basically, on the floor of the city council.
Wow.
And they had a there was so much talk about it that they had a city council meeting that they opened up. And of course there's COVID. So they had this in this gigantic auditorium where they have plays and concerts. So we had the city council meeting in this like overwhelming like amphitheater building this summer, late summer, I guess, maybe early fall. And it was an open mic for the community to talk on the bill. And there were a lot of people that came to demonize the poor and to support all the new laws. But the overwhelming majority of the people that chose to speak were against it, were for the people of the streets. I was disappointed. I was serving a church for a while. I'm no longer in a pulpit, but I was one of the few people that kind of came to preach against it. And the main person was a Unitarian Universalist, but all of our, and there's more churches practically in Cookeville than there are. I mean, there's so many churches here, but the mainstream ministers did not. They stayed away, and I was disappointed with that. But there's this myth that Cookeville is too friendly for the homeless. It's too easy for them here, and so that's how they're justifying all this. Do you have anything planned, anything public planned that people could participate in around this new law? Are you guys going to do any kind of a public activity around it?
We're actually looking at that right now. Yes, I think it was yesterday the bill passed the committee level, and we were hoping that there'd be more discussion, or we know how the legislature is going to vote. We were hoping to see a little bit more kind of, I don't know, understanding or like hesitancy about passing it so quickly. So we're trying to regroup right now, but we are really interested in talking to other groups across the state, because if we're going to defeat this bill or really kind of slow it down or take the bite out of it, take the teeth out of it, it's going to have to be with other rural groups. What we see in Tennessee again and again and again is that the progressive city hubs have more democratic leaning and more kind of like open-minded to these social issues kind of representatives, but that they're easily defeated, and that, the representatives and senators from the more rural areas tend to be more conservative, lean right, and also kind of pushing for, unfortunately, these very unjust bills. So we're very interested in working with y'all and brainstorming with y'all. I mean, we're in Nashville, so we can kind of help organize things, but yeah, we're all ears. People can follow Open Table Nashville. We will post calls to action, and we'll regroup to figure out what's the next step.
Is the Holy Week suspended because of the pandemic? Like, as far as you all doing a big street thing, or are you doing anything next week?
We haven't organized a big event like we normally do because of the pandemic. And We're going to be figuring out a couple things with some friends, but we, every year for really until last year with the pandemic, for the last like 10 plus years, maybe 11 or 12, we've tried to do a citywide Stations of the Cross on Good Friday where we ask, where is Christ being crucified today in the guise of the poor? And we journey on foot to different places like, our state capitol is where the death sentences are doled out, by our governors and our elected officials who claim to be pro-life but are still doling out death sentences to people through their policies and through actual executions. So we always end up at the state capitol. But it's a really beautiful and really meaningful and moving time. And I'm excited I hope that more people will be doing more of those things out in the streets and kind of like public liturgies. We've also had years past where we've done a Holy Week on the streets, which I think you kind of mentioned where, we have groups that for 24 hours are out on the streets with our people, not to minister to them, but to be with them, to be present, to learn from them, and to deepen our own grasp and to read scripture on the streets, because the gospel and scripture were never meant to just be read in our private atmospheres. Where we read scripture affects how we read scripture. So
Cookeville's not that big of a place, and we have some very prominent people that live in a very prominent part of town, and I want to go and have a vigil at their house, but I've been talked out of it so far. But if you want to come with me, and of course we'll wear our masks and go pray at Congressman Williams' house with me, let me know. It can be arranged. I'm thinking, should we do something? I know we're on live internet right now, but should we do something online on next Friday instead of going to the? Should we pray for the unhoused and incarcerated online? I'm just spitballing here that I've watched from afar. Usually Calvin, my friend Calvin Kimbrough,
Calvin.
So I've usually watched with Calvin's pictures after the fact, but I think we really want to start this up in Cookeville, but it might not happen. It might not happen this year. So tell me about. I'm kind of dancing around the book. By the way, we're on Justice Devotions. I'm Andrew Smith. My guest is Lindsey Krinks, and we're talking today because she has a brand new book, which you should go and buy, an autobiography called Praying with Our Feet. If you are in the city of Nashville, please go to Parnassus Books on Hillsborough Road, because you can get a signed copy, and you will also be supporting a independent bookstore, not Amazon. But if you are going to buy it, it is available everywhere you can buy books online. Tell me about this Church Without Walls Catholic worker movement, Amos House, and were you ordained simply by your friends? Basically, did they just all get together and said, "We're going to make you Reverend Lindsey today"? Like there was no ecclesial body behind this. This was just a true house church kind of thing. Is that?
Yeah. So, well, kind of. So partly yes, but. We started Amos House back in 2009, I believe. And, we were all kind of like the people that had been either kicked out of or were exiled from our, faith traditions. So we had, recovering Church of Christers, we had recovering Catholics, we had, folks who were ecumenical, we had agnostic friends that joined. We were just kind of a group of, misfits in faith. And all of us were united by our love for justice and our really kind of our pull toward the Catholic worker movement, where there's the works of mercy and the acts of justice. So we started this house church, but we actually we wanted it to be an official church. So it was an official church registered with, the good old IRS. We have a number, all that jazz, because we wanted to be able to take donations to put back into our work. A couple of us were working at a nonprofit at that time, and the funding had a lot of strings attached. And we'd come across people all the time that couldn't get through the hurdles. So we did that. So I was ordained in an actual church, but there's not a denominational body behind me. So I was ordained by I did a discernment process with our faith community, with Amos House. And, on my ordination paperwork, the members of our faith community, and then, Jeannie Alexander, who had been ordained, and Charlie Strobel, who started Room in the Inn here and was a former Catholic priest, they signed off on the ordination. And then, my friends on the streets were part of the call to ministry. Amos House isn't meeting in person right now, and hasn't for a few years, because all of us are doing different things. We always felt like it was a very organic group, and we had Amos House for about 7 years, very active. And, our goal was never to make it about the institution. So instead of serving an institution, it was very clear to me that my calling was not to a church with walls, or to any institution. It was to the streets, to the wild, abandoned, forgotten places where I find God, where I fall in love with the people there and learn from them. And like you were kind of saying, am saved by them. I find my own liberation in this work. I think it's Flannery O'Connor who had that story, "The life you save may be your own." And that's kind of how I found my work. And it sounds like you have found that too. So yeah, the calling that I have is to the folks who are outside of institution. And Amos House was the vehicle that could make that official for me back in the day when we were going strong, and it was really fun.
Well, so I was a commissioned elder, which is not quite a reverend, in the Presbyterian USA for 3.5 years. And I'm still an ordained ruling elder in the Presbyterian USA tradition. I have also been worshiping a lot online lately with the United Church of Christ. Mm. I'm from up north, so I'd never heard of the David Lipscomb Church of Christ until I got to. So when I always thought Church of Christ, I thought it was UCC. And it was so funny when I got to Tennessee, everybody kept talking about it, and I was unchurched. I still am kind of unchurched, but I was like really like secular weirdo for a while. And so when I got to Tennessee Tech here in Cookeville, people kept saying Church of Christ. I was like, what's this Church of Christ? I think my grandpa was Church of Christ, and I come from this very liberal Christian lineage. So anyway, so we started in 2010, come together as an unchurch here in Cookeville. And even though Cookeville is very kind of monotone, very monochromatic, very, very, heteronormative. Anyway, so we have this very queer, Black, we have a multiracial, multi-gendered unchurch that we started in 2010 that keeps falling apart and then putting itself back together again. So anyway, after I read your book, I proposed to the whole group. See what kind of a troublemaker you are, Lindsey Krinks, I'll tell you. So I proposed to the whole group that we should all ordain each other. So we're going to have a mutual ordination service on Holy Saturday. And so we're all going to get ordained, because people find out you're in a church, they call you reverend anyway, like, I can't even, and I was like, well, in the Presbyterian polity, we actually have these different levels, and they don't care about Presbyterian like if you have a Bible and you talk a lot, they just, and you have some, I don't know, a very fine shred of holiness. One thing we haven't talked about yet that I think we've kind of beat around the bush a little bit about, that I think needs to happen today, especially because of what's going on. We've talked about, I've called out my local representative, and I talked about where there's a condominium where there used to be a house of hospitality in Ponce de Leon in Atlanta. Mm. But we haven't really named the problem. You've danced around it in some of your comments, and I think it's important to remind ourselves. So we've talked about radical hospitality on the streets that is non-judgmental and is very inclusive, meaning we're not telling them that they have to go to AA. Mm-hmm. By the way, I'm an alcoholic that's been sober. I'll be 12 years sober in May. So I identify with my friends on the streets for that particular reason. But I also don't feel that my job is to bring an AA meet. I go to AA, but I don't feel like my job is to bring an AA meeting to them, right? When I go on the streets. But what is when we talk about the systemic issues, we've kind of alluded. Can you help me name some of these powers and principalities just to get real here for a minute, because I think sometimes because of civility and being nice all the time, and it's the South and bless my heart, what are we up against right now? Can you name some of the systemic issues to where that world that we both desire, which is, you called it the beloved community, and I believe you called it the kingdom of God, and I'm a citizen of the beloved community that Dr. King spoke of. But by accident, I accidentally, landed here. But they haven't kicked me out of the beloved community yet. So I haven't been.
People get kicked out of that, by the way.
I haven't been excommunicated from the misfit, marginalized church. But what are we fighting against? This isn't just because we're peace and love type. We're not always nice. Let me read you this quote from your book. Okay, this is the quote of the day. Hot anger destroys. This is on page 145 in your book. Hot anger destroys, and sometimes our structures and systems need to be leveled, burned to the ground. But other times we need to cool our anger so it can be channeled and directed. What are those structures and systems that people like you and me actually sometimes want to burn to the ground? What can you name some of these problems for us?
Let's do it. Capitalism. We've got the value of profit and money over human life and human flourishing and human dignity. This is one of the hugest overarching systems. And then you put capitalism with white supremacy. And, private property and whiteness go hand in hand and always have. The construction of whiteness and the construction of private property. They have wreaked so much havoc, and we can see the utter destruction that is being reaped right now by those things. I'll also add the systems, our current systems of policing and mass incarceration do not heal. They do no good. They are based, especially in the South, they are deeply rooted in white supremacy, when property owners would pay poor whites to go around and look for, runaway slaves. This is how policing started in the South. These are the roots. And the racial injustice is still being perpetuated by the institutions that are doling out justice. For instance, we had a woman who had been living on a bench, one bench for like the last 4 years. And a month ago, the police went to serve her with a notice that it was a, public city bus bench. And the buses didn't want her sitting there anymore. So they were going to arrest her if she didn't leave. And we had an outreach worker, a friend from another organization, who said, you police officers, she's not causing any harm. And they said, it's our job. It's our job to uphold the law. Their job was not to protect her. Their job is to protect private property. And too often that's what we see. And on the mass incarceration and policing note, one of the things we've seen systemically since the 1970s, especially in the 1980s, is the mass gutting of funding for public housing. This was started by Reagan in the 80s. He completely gutted funding for HUD and other social services with it. And what's happened since then is we continue to gut HUD. We're actually more hopeful than we've ever been with the federal administration about restoring some of that funding right now. But there's still a long way to go. Along with that, you see over the last 30, 40 years, you see federal funding for housing being cut. In Tennessee, we've cut food stamps in the last years. In Tennessee, we're denying people health care. We're basically stripping social services and cutting funding from them at a federal level and a state level. And then we're adding funding to policing and to mass incarceration. So where are people going to go? We all know that this is a business. It's an industry. The private corporations like CoreCivic, who used to be CCA, who are running our private prisons, are making bank on these policies, on on our immigration policies, right, that are happening often in red states, but certainly from our federal government too, where there's a kind of rounding up of and caging and then deporting people. Private groups are making bank on this, y'all. They're making bank on the incarceration of Black, brown, and poor bodies and people with mental health care that should be offered services and should have resources and social safety nets, but those have all been taken away. So those are a few things that I wanted to name. I could get on a soapbox even longer about this, but I'll stop ranting and preaching there.
Just add heteropatriarchy, and we're almost there.
Thank you.
So,
absolutely.
Presbyterian Voices for Justice was born of a feminist movement in the PCUSA that was ordaining women but putting forth a feminist visioning of God. They were bringing in the feminine pronouns, and they almost all got ran out of the PCUSA in the 90s for invoking the feminine divine. And that was Voices of Sophia, and then the Witherspoon Society. I don't know. Do you remember Gene Tassell? Did you ever know Gene Tassell from Nashville?
I'm not sure.
He was at Second Pres. He also taught at Vanderbilt. So he might have. He's passed away now, but he was a Nashville guy that was in this group, and my parents were involved in this group, and we actually folded last year, and we had this Facebook page with like a lot of people on it. So this other pastor from the West Coast and we said, can we just keep the spirit of it alive? But we're like the far left of the PCUSA, and we've been around since at least the 80s, and I'm rootless right now. I keep my membership in the Presbyterian Church, but Calvin and I never got along that well. So I'm like you, a deeply ecumenical interfaith a street preacher as well. So this has been Justice Devotions. I just wanted you to know what you just sat in on, what the genesis was. So my guest for the last hour has been Lindsey Krinks. She's a street chaplain. She works with the Open Table in Nashville, Tennessee. She's got a brand new book. So you can Google Lindsey Krinks, and Praying with Our Feet is available. And if you are in Middle Tennessee, you should go and get it from Parnassus. Have they called you yet to bring more by? Have they sold out yet? Do you know?
They've been selling well. I know they've made a couple orders or a few orders. So I've got to go pick up a few books for my son soon. And so I'm excited to see how it's doing there. But a lot of people have been ordering.
Congratulations on being the new parents to you and Andrew. Do you haven't felt that you have to retire though from your work because you're a mom now?
I can't wait to bring him. He's 8 months old, so he's teething, which is a task. But I can't wait to take him out on the streets with me. It's going to be great.
Yeah, I got in trouble. I got scolded, let me say, when I brought my daughter to a protest against. It was a protest against Al Gore when he visited MTSU, and this was the global justice movement. So this was right around 2000, and it had to do with, that was back when everybody was like global capitalism was the thing. I know we have to wrap this up, but it's a weird time to be living in because I feel like some of our best. I'm so grateful to see how much you write about Dorothy Day and the Open Door community. And I looked at the old Amos House website. I realized you haven't updated it recently, but you have a long explanation of what a Christian anarchist is for people who don't like the A word. I loved that. But I feel like the right stole some of our stuff. And people on the left who are anti-authoritarians, who don't believe in hierarchy and don't believe in, in big government, that we have to kind of fight for our little portion of the left to make sure that they understand we share their values, to lift up the poor and for a just interracial society, and that we believe in science and stuff like that. But it's wild times in which we're living.
It is.
Would you offer our listeners and me a benediction for our time that we've had today? Either just a word of encouragement or a prayer, however you'd like to help it take us out today, Lindsey.
Absolutely. We're moving into Holy Week, and Holy Week is when we start Holy Week on Palm Sunday, when Jesus entered the gates of the city, wept over the city, and entered into the tension and the conflict that would end in his betrayal and death. My prayer for all your listeners is that we will have the courage to enter into the conflict and tensions of our cities and towns, and do so with a fire in our bones of love and justice. And may we be lit and have eyes to see the living Christ in our midst. And so blessings to all of you on the kind of edge and verge of this Holy Week that we're coming into.
Well, thank you. I wish you and Andrew and your beautiful young child a fantastic, meaningful Easter season. But we don't get to Easter by we got to go through the cross and walk with our siblings who are incarcerated and on the streets these next several days. So this concludes another edition of Justice Devotions. I'm Andrew Smith. We'll be back whenever we are. And Lindsey, congratulations on the fantastic book, and blessings in all your work that you're doing. And I'm sure we'll see each other on the streets again sometime soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.